Hi, my name is Franziska and I have founded WePlan Software together with Lana a few years ago. We now provide smart manpower planning solutions to airlines and other participants of the industry. We both have worked for many years as consultants in the industry, focusing on resource management. During that time, we noticed that many of our clients were struggling with either historically grown Excel documents or because their tools did not really support the process. This is why we decided to put our 10 years of experience into developing our own solution that truly helps the problems of the manpower planning teams and also helps them to create cost-optimal plans. WePlan was initially developed for airlines, but is now also used by other companies such as ground handling, MRO companies, or cargo handlers. In our presentation today, we would like to share our observations how the crisis has changed the approach of airlines to manpower planning of their aircrew, but also of their other operational workforce. The first trend for sure is that there is an increased speed and transparency required in manpower planning. But also secondly, we would like to focus on the topic that due to the pandemic, there's a lot more need for collaboration and integration between the different components and parties in manpower planning. Volatile demands and jumping actual costs are driving the need for more speed and transparency in staff planning. There are multiple reasons for that. First of all, the avoidance of loss is driving all of our thinking, so a lag-based costing approach is much more important than ever. In addition, the network is continuously being changed, and depending on travel restrictions or depending on the customer need per region, you have to assess and reassess all the time what routes should be open, what routes should be closed, and so on. And finally, you can't really rely on historic data anymore. So nothing is as it was before, so you can't base your planning assumptions on the history. So currently a lot of questions are being asked to the manpower planning team and to the operations team. The first important question for sure is what parts of the network should be opened and what parts of the network should be open at what point of time. Then consequently, the question is being asked, how much crew do we need? How much will it cost? And on top of that, we do have other complexities. So for example, a lot of our customers are currently renegotiating their crew contracts because of the pandemic, and depending on what the outcome of those negotiations is, that will also have an impact on your crew demand. And finally, who's available when? And that is also much more difficult than it was before because of new considerations and complexities that come on top. For example, crew being on furlough or crew on reduced hours or other factors such as the current training activities. The traditional approach to manpower planning was characterized by long lead times and structured, rather rigid update processes. This means that many of our clients started to calculate their manpower planning 18 months before the day of operation. They then had enough time to refine those assumptions, to recalculate, and also to update their assumptions by, for example, uploading their pairing reports to refine the number of crew that they need on the day. The new speed of decision making is pushing the full planning process together, revealing process and system shortfalls. The most important shortfall is that the traditional approach of calculating the crew demand is too time consuming, especially when you have to recalculate a lot of scenarios in a very short time. Furthermore, another observation that we have is that the missing integration between manpower planning and the other departments such as HR or the training department becomes now more eminent. And it also creates a lot of additional manual effort in the manpower planning team to understand how much crew is needed at what point of time and who's available. So how can we help the manpower planning team to assess the flight schedule in a very short time frame? So what is really needed from a manpower planning perspective is a solution where you can upload your flight schedule and then it tells you within seconds how much crew you need and what the costs are. So it would give you an immediate answer on KPIs such as the number of duty days, the number of FTE, the different costs that come along with the flight schedule, such as, for example, the hotel costs, the transportation costs, and so on. and also the impact on training activities and the actual crew supply that is needed. By having such a solution, your manpower planning team is able to answer 3 very important questions. The first one is the assessment of the flight schedule changes. So by uploading your flight schedule, you can immediately understand the cost of your flight schedule, meaning that you can analyze cost-intensive pairings, or you could also do a leg-based costing approach. This facilitates discussions with your commercial team to understand what costs are driven by the network that you put in. The second use case is to support strategic decisions, meaning that you can understand what it means from a crew perspective to open or close new bases, to add new qualifications, and so on. The last use case I would like to mention here is the support of crew negotiations. By analyzing the impact of each individual rule, you are then able to understand what the costs are of your crew agreement. Then you can also compare it to, for example, the legal minimums such as EASA or the FAA rules to understand what are the costs behind it. In the last month, we have worked extensively on developing a solution that helps the manpower planning team to answer those questions. The whole approach is based on the principle that the classic lengthy and holistic planning approach is replaced by an ad hoc but rather focused assessment. This means that whenever you get a flight schedule or there are union rule adoptions, then you come to the question, can we cover the new flight schedule with our current crew supply, and how much costs are incurred by the flight schedule? The question is rather now how to get a preferably good estimation without running a full roster and pairing optimization. In our solution assessment, we decided to look holistically on the pairing rules and also on the rostering rules. There's a 2-step approach in our methodology, and we start with a pairing rule assessment. The solution approach is a lightweight pairing optimization, meaning that we use a scalable column generation optimization framework, as it is the most flexible to be adjusted to individual airline networks. We only consider the most important rules which have the largest impact on the FTE numbers. This means for sure that you can't really use the generated pairings afterwards to put them into your rosters, because you will have additional rules that come on top. So for example, your fatigue management rules. But the KPIs that are generated, they are very, very close to the reality, and it helps you to understand what is the initial number of crew that I need. Those rules could be around the maximum flight duty period per pairing, and also about layover times and so on. We also include costs here, so because it's an optimization, we have to include costs on HOTAG, on transportation, and so on. The second step is on the assessment of rostering rules. Here we have a statistical rule evaluation by a rolling horizon method. This means that we slice through the different pairings and evaluate the FTE impact of each individual rule. So for example, that could be around duty hours per FTE, that could be around minimum number of off days or other factors. The approach is then also anticipating the additional FTE caused by the inefficiency when combining the pairings. To give you an example and to illustrate what we mean, here we have an example of one rule that should be evaluated, and that's around minimum 4 off days after pairing block lengths greater than 4 days. As you can see here, we have in week 1, we have 2 pairings. Now when combining the 2 pairings, the tool would identify where inefficiencies are caused in the roster. So here you can see for the first pairing it perfectly fits. We give 4 off days and that's fine. But for the second combination, we are creating 1 day of inefficiency in the rosters, and then it anticipates the total level of inefficiencies in the rosters. To be airline business model agnostic, different focuses are set within the solution assessment. So for example, on one hand, we have a cargo airline, and the business model is a single base, single fleet. We have a long-haul operation in combination with a hub-and-spoke-like network with many decentral connections. The main focus is on the pairing side, because the FTE number is mainly driven by the amount of flights with augmented crew and also by the layover rules. On the other hand, we have a European charter carrier The business model is different, so we have a multi-base single fleet model. We have a short-haul operation operated as a multiple separate hub and spoke network, and there are no or just very few layover days of crew and aircrafts at spokes. In that case, the main focus is rather on the roster side, because the FTE number is mainly driven by rostering rules, such as, for example, the off-day rules and the possible connections of the pairings. The second trend I would like to talk about today is the collaboration and integration that is now much more required than before. On one hand, this focuses on the collaboration within your operations team, so between manpower planning, between crew planning and network planning. But on the other hand, this also means integration across all the staff groups of the company. So air crew, ground operations, your MRO crew, and so on. So the first part is that manpower planning needs to be a lot more integrated with other ops departments. So once having received the schedule, the manpower planning team needs to proactively steer all the subsequent departments in the operation, meaning that you would have a continuous review of your KPIs with your finance department. You would have a continuous exchange with your HR team to review and also simulate different working contracts depending on the situation. You would have a continuous learning process with your crew planning, and much more important, especially today, is also the exchange with training, where you have to holistically look at both components, so commercial flying and training, to make sure that both fits together. And finally, we also believe that there needs to be a lot more integration with your ground ops team and also other crew groups, such as, for example, MRO staff. So what does it mean from a system perspective, and how should vendors also enable the manpower planning team to accomplish that mission? From our perspective, the mission for manpower planning should be really one central and integrated platform to collaborate across multiple departments. So on one hand, you have your network planning that pushes the flight schedule into the platform. On the other hand, you have integration set up with all the different data sources in your operation. For example, your crew databases, your training systems, your staff planning solutions, or your holiday solutions. By having all this data in one platform, you are then really able to compare demand and supply and to manage your crew supply accordingly. Once you have all the data in the system, you can then add a lot of different components on top. So for example, the simulation of scenarios or the optimization of absences or training and so on. Also, a big benefit of having all that data in one system is that you can use it to run post-planning analytics. So you can go back, you can learn from the past, you can understand how your assumptions behaved, and so on. And finally, from our perspective, manpower planning and also the platform behind it should really facilitate collaboration across the different teams. This means that every party in the company and every stakeholder gets access to the system. There are different views on the data, different access rights. You can share reports, and that should really replace all the email exchange that is going on in airlines nowadays. In the last month, we have seen a lot of airlines that started to integrate their manpower planning for all the different staff groups. The reason is that in order to really manage the ramp up and to understand your bottlenecks, it's very, very helpful to have all your staff groups in one system. So depending on the speed of recovery and depending on the different assumptions that you put in for the different planning groups, you then can very easily understand what your critical path is for the ramp up. Whether it is your training for your aircrew or your activation of your ground staff or your availability of your MRO team. So that really helps you to make data-driven decisions. To integrate this and to reach this goal as a manpower planning system, you need to offer different functionalities for the different crew groups. So you can't just have a one-fits-all solution. You need to think about what is important for the different planning groups, how is the planning actually be done. So when looking at one example now here, compared to flight crew, where you would base your crew demand on the flight schedule to understand what are the productivity levels to come up with your total crew number, for your ground operation and your MRO operation, you would do it completely different. You would also start using your flight schedule and add further components on top, for example, your SLAs. But then you would really calculate your crew demand based on the operational procedures in your company. So for example, for ground handling, you would have your below wing processes and your above wing processes. And then you would define per process the lockup time and also the required qualifications. You can then add a lot more complexity to it by differentiating between different destinations and so on. But by adding the cost then finally to your model, so your internal labor cost, your external labor cost, you then get your final answer on what are the labor costs per service and also the labor cost per SLA. So quite different to flight crew. So finally, this means that the trend of an integrated planning solution requires an integrated but modular setup of the planning systems of the future. So you would have basic functionalities that are applicable to all the staff groups in your company, but then you have also specific modules that can only be used because the process of planning is still different between the different staff groups. And finally, this means there needs to be a lot more flexibility when it comes to integration with the different solutions per staff group. So you would have different staff planning solutions for duty planning and for time and attendance and so on that all need to feed into your manpower planning system. So that's also very important. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed our presentation. If you now have questions, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, you can find our contact details here. And we wish you a great conference.